All right, welcome to our last session, and this is going to be on diseases and disorders in the garden. So in this section, we're going to talk about some of the more common environmental or pathogenic diseases that can happen to our garden plants and some ideas on how to manage them. Now, keep in mind, we can't go over every single possible disease that you might encounter in the garden. We're going to cover the ones that are most frequently encountered and the ones that are maybe the most likely to occur across the state. We have included a lot of resources and reference material for you in this section so that you can solve problems that fall outside of what we cover in these talks. So here's one to think about. What might be going wrong with this pepper? Well, this is a common example of something that is not caused by a disease, but rather the environment, and that's pepper sunscald. Basically, the pepper has received a sunburn, and it often happens when a young plant doesn't have sufficient foliage to shield the fruit, or perhaps the plant has been nitrogen deprived. So we're often tempted to buy those little plants in the greenhouse that already have fruit growing on them, and this would be one time where I would say don't do it. Buy a plant that looks really robust and healthy. The fruits will come, and they'll be much less likely to develop sunburn like this one. Here's another problem that would be easy to attribute to a disease, but it's actually an environmental response. So this is physiological leaf roll of tomato. Now you can see the picture on the left. You would think, oh my goodness, all of my tomatoes have a terrible wilt. They're all dying. They must be diseased. Well, what happens, in fact, is when tomato plants are under a lot of water pressure, so maybe they've been flooded, maybe your neighbor left their sprinkler on all night and it creeped under your fence and it got into your garden. When a tomato plant is under saturated soil conditions, it can do this leaf roll. You notice the leaves are kind of rolling upward and the whole plant looks wilted. Well, what do we do when we see a wilted plant? We water it more, and so that can make the problem even worse. So before you jump to the conclusion that it's a disease or something else or you need to remove that plant, think about the environment, and is there anything that would lead you to believe that this could just be physiological leaf roll? And just to mention that some of the heirloom varieties seem to be much more susceptible to this than others. So here's another issue that again is related to the plant's environment, or rather it's a calcium deficiency localized in the developing fruit. So you might think, well, I should just spray calcium on the plant. Well, sometimes that can help, but what's really going on is that usually in the cool, wet, early part of the summer, the plant is not able to take up the calcium that's already present in the soil. And so those first developing fruits will develop this brown, sunken, rotten spot on the bottom, and it's called blossom end rot. And it can happen in peppers, tomatoes, and eggplants, but we most often see it in tomatoes. So how to prevent both blossom end rot and physiological leaf roll? Well, consistent watering is going to be the best tool that you have in your arsenal. And the picture on the right shows a drip irrigation system. That can be a great way to deliver just the water that the plant needs when it needs it. And the other on the left is a picture of using a mulch. And this will really help to regulate the drying and wetting of the soil. And that can lead to both of those problems. So one common question we receive quite often is, why don't I have any tomatoes on my plants? Well, there are several things that can cause this. So planting your tomatoes in an area that doesn't get 8 to 10 hours of sun can cause the tomatoes to be very slow to ripen or to maybe not even set fruit. Too much nitrogen fertilizer. So if you're looking at fertilizer products, the first number on the package, or if you've been using a lot of manures, sometimes too much nitrogen can encourage green leafy growth at the expense of fruit. If the weather is too hot or too cold, that can lead to blossoms just dropping off. Also, it may just be that you haven't waited long enough. Some of these tomatoes, especially the slow varieties like the big heirlooms, may take 90 to 100 days to ripen. So unless you're living in the warmest part of the state, or you started very, very early and you used some sort of greenhouse or protective structure, maybe why you're not getting tomatoes. We just had to throw this in here because I do have a dog that eats tomatoes. It could be that your tomatoes are being pilfered as well. So make sure that you think about all the options and don't just jump to conclusions. So let's talk about potatoes a little bit. Some of us enjoy digging up sculptural potatoes from the garden. Others think there must be something going on and this has got to be a problem. Well, it's really due to fluctuations in temperature and moisture, or if you have a heavy and rocky soil. So you can't do a whole lot about fluctuations in temperature, though you can mulch, and you can be really try to irrigate consistently and mulch plants so that they're not experiencing quite as extreme ups and downs in terms of moisture and heat. And if you do have a really heavy or rocky soil, you might consider amending that soil even more or building raised beds. So green potatoes, this really again is not a disease. It's simply that the potato tuber has been exposed to the sun and has not had enough cover. So you'll want to mulch or hill your potatoes to protect that from happening. If you see the little potatoes starting to come out of the ground, throw some straw or some compost or some clean grass clippings or something over there so this doesn't happen. And that's because some people are very sensitive to the alkaloids in the potato skin once it's turned green and can have a pretty bad reaction to that. So if you don't know if you are, certainly don't eat the green parts at all, and peel those potatoes very carefully, but best to just prevent them from turning green in the first place. This can happen pretty quickly too, so even when you're digging your potatoes and storing them, make sure that they get out of the sunlight as soon as possible. So this is a really interesting one. We see this every couple of years. Someone will call and say, my potato is putting on tomatoes. Well, actually, these are the real potato fruits. And if you were to save the seeds from this, you could grow potatoes, though they probably wouldn't look anything like the potato that it came from. That's why we use pieces of potato to propagate them rather than seeds. The genetic variability is quite wild. So if you do see these little fruits forming on your potato plants, chalk it up to an unusual occurrence, show your friends, but don't eat them. And if you're really interested to see what might happen, you could always save the seeds and plant them. But like I said, it's going to be a grab bag of different kinds of potatoes that grow from the true seed. So just a couple more non-disease disorders that might happen in the garden and what causes them. So pollination is very important in our garden crops. And so if we don't have proper pollination, we often don't get proper fruit set. How many of you know that a squash plant has both male and female blossoms? Well, they do. And in the picture on the left, the male blossom has that straight stem, and the female blossom has a little ovary at the base, which is what becomes the developing squash. So one reason that you may not get squash on your squash plants is if you don't have female and male flowers that are open at the same time for pollination. If that's the case, usually just waiting another week or so for more flowers to develop and for more pollinators to show up can really help. So you could either see that the fruit just fails to develop completely, or it might be really shriveled at one end. So those are usually just pollination problems, and just get rid of that little plant, that little squash or cucumber, and wait for the next set. So this happens in corn as well. So you can see either the whole cob doesn't develop, or you have some missed kernels in there. Now, corn is pollinated by wind, not insects. And so the best way to ensure that your corn gets pollinated is to plant it in bigger blocks or circles or groups rather than single rows, so that you're getting good coverage from the wind from all sides of the plant. And here's just a really interesting group of issues. When you get something like this in your garden, it's usually a once in a blue moon kind of occurrence, and usually not going to cause a lot of problems. It's more of a fascination, and this is called fasciation, or just simply a mutation that occurs in the garden. Sometimes fasciation occurs because there's been a significant weather event. Oftentimes it's because there's been some sort of damage or trauma to the plant at a critical stage of growth. So you can see it can express itself in many different ways. On the left, you have corn that has developed kernels at the tops of the silks rather than down in the ears. Very unusual. This middle picture, potatoes were developing along the above ground stalks of the potato plant and not underground. Very weird. And on this last one, you have basically a Siamese twin of zucchini. So those two zucchinis were growing in very close proximity. Maybe that flower actually had a double ovary, and on pollination started to develop two separate fruits that became one. So these can be real fun conversation pieces. Share them with your friends or coworkers. But usually they're not going to be widespread in the garden. It'll just be, maybe one plant, maybe only once in a lifetime do you get something this weird. All right, so those were some of the non-pathogenic problems. Now we're going to talk about a few of the more common diseases that occur in our gardens. So Phytophthora, this is basically a fancy name for a common root rot that occurs in many different plants. We mostly here in the southwest part of the state see it in squash and melons. And that's because we tend to have a lot of furrow irrigation or flood irrigation. And this is a fungal disease that travels very, very quickly on water. So if you are using that kind of irrigation and you get a case of Phytophthora, it's going to spread very, very quickly. It causes yellowing, wilting, and pretty quick dieback of your plants. So pumpkin seems to be one of the most susceptible. Another good reason to use drip irrigation or to be very cautious in the way that you irrigate. So if you do think that you may have something like this, or you see plants that are showing these kinds of symptoms, remove the infected plants right away and destroy them so that you're not spreading it throughout the field or the garden. So Verticillium Fusarium, these are both fungal diseases. Again, these are naturally occurring present in the soil and don't tend to become active until a susceptible plant is planted. When you buy varieties of vegetable crops, particularly beans or tomatoes, you might notice some letters in the name, and those letters will signify a resistance to certain kinds of diseases or other problems. If you know that you have Verticillium or Fusarium in your soil, maybe you've had it diagnosed on another plant, then you certainly want to be one of the ones that look for a resistant variety. Now, we can't identify Fusarium versus Verticillium just based on a visual diagnosis. They look very, very similar. They both have late season yellowing and wilting. And when you cut into the stem of, like, for example, this tomato, you'll see some browning and streaking of those tissues under the skin of the stem. So the only way that we can tell for sure which one it is to have one of our pathology labs do a culture. So if you have an extension office near you that can get a sample to one of our pathologists, then great. That is really the only way to 100% know exactly what we're dealing with. So there are a lot of different kinds of bacterial wilts and blights, some of them that are more damaging than others. Some of them are just a simple spotting on some lower leaves that you can get rid of, but others, if they're not checked, can spread and take out a whole plant, a whole crop, or a whole field. Some of these issues are soil-borne, meaning they start out in the soil. Some of them are debris carried, so if you don't do a really good job of field cleanup or greenhouse cleanup, you can carry over those bacterial spores from year to year. Some of these even are seed-borne, so the plant seed is infected before you even plant it. Again, a lot of these look similar, and often it doesn't even really matter what the original cause is, because once it starts, there really aren't any treatments. So that's why being very observant in your garden, pulling off those leaves if you see anything that looks like that, and if you see a plant that starts to become really effective, get it out of there, because it's only going to spread, and there really aren't any sprays or treatments that are going to stop it. So powdery mildew is another common fungal disease that we see in gardens. We see it a lot in squash and cucumbers. It is species specific, so just because you have powdery mildew, say, on your squash plants, doesn't mean that it's going to jump to your grapes. They are completely different species of the same kind of fungus. We can avoid overhead watering, trying to keep those leaves dry. If you do see an infected leaf, remove it so that it doesn't have a chance to spread to others. And there are some commercial baking soda based and sulfur based treatments. I don't recommend just using baking soda. That's not a registered or approved pesticide. but those are some of the natural ingredients and some of the organic treatments. There are some other chemical treatments for powdery mildew as well. You just want to read the label and make sure that they're safe and effective for use on food crops. So like I said, we really can't cover all the different diseases and problems, but I wanted to show you this slide because there are so many things in plant diseases that look like other things, and it is really a hard thing to be a plant doctor. So if you do have a problem that you can't diagnose, take a sample into, if you have a local reputable garden center and you don't have an extension office in your town or county, that can be a way to go. But if you do have an extension office and they have trained master gardeners and horticulture faculty on site, they will really be able to help you identify your problems. So you can see up in the top left, it could be powdery mildew. It might be another problem called downy mildew. One time we actually even saw a plant that looked like this, and under the microscope, it had actually had battery acid dripped on the plant. So you never quite know what's going on. So the tomato plant in the upper right, it could be a bacterial wilt, it could be a fungal wilt. A lot of these things look the same when they start out, but in any case, that plant does not look good, and I would remove it before it spreads to the healthier one on the right. So this one on the bottom right, this is typically a phosphorus deficiency in a young tomato plant, that purple veins and the purple markings you see there. But sometimes herbicide damage or weed killer damage can cause similar looking effects in your plants. And then the one on the left, again, just a simple rolled leaf could be a number of different things. So always look at the environment. Is there anything that stands out to you as being different or possibly contributing to the problem? And then take a good sample somewhere and get an appropriate diagnosis before you take action. So I really hope that you don't experience any of those problems in your garden, but if you do, know that prevention is key and that quick and swift removal of any diseased plants are going to really stop the spread of that throughout.